Chrissy, did you get the message that Karen Moran was running a little late due to traffic?
Yep, we'll get started without her, and then she can join us. I think we just got the traditional lead in here, so.
So I'd like to add public comment to this.
So you'll need to do that when I call for approval of the agenda, then you'll have to verbalize that. Okay, it's 6:30. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to call to order the City Council 2023-2028 Transportation Capital Improvement Plan Workshop to order. Madam City Clerk, would you call the roll, please? Actually, we don't have roll call on a workshop, so we're all good there. Meeting accessibility pursuant to the Governor's Emergency Proclamation 20-28. The city is unable to provide an in-person location for the public to listen to the virtual City Council meeting this evening. Meetings are still accessible to the public, and public comment is able to be submitted by email to the city clerk at lhachey@samamish.us and the city council at citycouncil@samamish.us. And Mr. City Manager, if I'm not mistaken, this is the last meeting where the public will no longer be able to join us. They'll be able to join us on May 3rd, correct?
Mayor, that's correct. As of May 3rd, council meetings and public meetings for the city will be open to the public.
Perfect. Council, we don't have a formal approval of the agenda, and public comment was removed because this is a workshop, but I understand that there is desire potentially to add that. So, Councilmember Lamb?
I'd like to motion to add public comment before the transportation presentation.
I'll second that.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Discussion? I'll speak to it briefly. My preference would be to have it afterwards. It was intentionally kind of omitted from this because it is a workshop and not a traditional city council meeting. And it might actually benefit the public to have it afterwards, because then they will also have the benefit of having listened to the information presented in the TCIP and might be able to provide us better feedback. So I would make an amendment to put it at the end.
I'll second that.
Okay, amendment's been moved and seconded. Discussion on the amendment. Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay.
Nay.
Okay, the nays have it. Back to the main motion, which is to add public comment to the beginning of the meeting. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed?
Nay.
Nay. Okay. By a vote of 3-2, the ayes have it. We will add public comments, so we will do that right off the bat. Madam City Clerk, do we have anyone wishing to give public comment?
Yes, I have 4 people have raised their hands.
Okay. Because we don't have public comment, I don't have the traditional, I did read the meeting accessibility already, but you'll need to raise your hand, use the raise your hand feature if you're on Zoom, *9 if you are calling in order to raise your hand.
Okay. I see we have 5 people in attendance to provide public comment tonight. I will unmute callers in the order they have raised their hands. You will have 3 minutes to provide comment. 15 seconds before your 3 minutes is complete, I will provide a time warning. At 3 minutes, you will be muted and converted back to an attendee. Please start your comment by stating your name and the city you live in for the record. I will now unmute the first caller. We're up to 7 commenters now. Paula.
Happy Tuesday evening, Mayor and council members. My name is Paula Harper Christensen, Smamish resident for 35 years. Tonight, we are on the indigenous land of the Coast Salish peoples, who have reserved treaty rights to this land specifically the Snoqualmie Indian tribe. I thank these caretakers of this land who have lived and continue to live here since time immemorial. Smamish is lovely from so many perspectives: national and state awards, natural walking trails, and environmentally friendly parks that invite families to multicultural activities that are free. Camps for kids, farmers market, outdoor movies, and lively summer concerts pull neighbors together. Thank you for the opportunity to make public comment. Through listening, we build healthy relationships as we hear different opinions from the residents, council, and city leaders. Keeping your camera on assists in building these symbiotic relationships so we can build our commonality. I would like to request that we keep public comments at the same time, the beginning of the meeting, so that the speakers know what to expect. Also, I find that 15-second warning distracting, and I'm wondering if a small screen camera or something could be used. Next, I would like to address transparency. We have conflict in Smamish, and we cannot let conflict win over neighborly cooperation. To create a welcoming, supporting, inclusive community that looks out for each other, we must tell the truth. We want to know. We have a right to know. Please do not assume the residents do not want to see relevant city reports. Secrecy is the gateway to conspiracy and corruption. We do not want that in our city. Complete and total transparency must be regularly applied to disinfect any government from toxic temptations of secrecy and obfuscation. Transparency is not only a fundamental requirement of a functioning government, it is also our right. Democracy dies in darkness, so let us flourish in the truth and the light. Be well.
I will now unmute the second caller.
Good evening, City Council, staff, and community. My name is Carrie Bosworth, and I'm a Smamish resident for 4 years. When I moved here, I was super impressed with the city. I read these mailers cover to cover. It was just so exciting to see all the things that were happening right here, just down the street. I was super impressed, especially with all the activities for the children. And on that note, I heard that the Earth Day celebration this past weekend was lovely. So thank you so much for that. A few years ago, I stopped reading them with as much enthusiasm because it felt like the city was just sort of shutting down, and not because of the pandemic. But last week, I was super excited about the discussion of the parks, including the Beaton Hill and Big Rock Park South. What amazing opportunities we have here to design and figure out how to use them. I appreciated the thoughtful discussion that you all had on trying to preserve the existing structures as well as the landscape. I mentioned these over the weekend to my sister, who does not live here, and she would like to ensure that you anticipate and plan for adequate parking. I'm interested to hear more about the Transportation Capital Improvement Plan this evening, as we do need some active transportation improvement plan in place. We also need adequate funding for these projects, and we also need a plan in place to ensure that we are ready to take advantage of grants that can help do that funding. I hope that we don't race back into any large scale lane addition projects until we figure out exactly what we're doing based on community wants and needs. Thank you for your time. Have a great evening.
I will now unmute the third caller. Mr. Valderrama?
Can you see me?
Yes.
All right, well, I'll start here. It's like going. Former Deputy Mayor Romero Valderrama, we are here for yet another episode of Malchowgate, the long-running city saga of alleged ethical violations and mishandling of confidential information by city manager Mayor Malchow and other council members. Now the episode is Devil is in the Dirty Details, where Mayor Malchow stated last week that she is struggling after the cover-ups revealed of the handling of the PRR, and now doesn't want the city and staff to see the dirty details of the taxpayer investigation of Rudet requiring 4 attorneys, and as I recall, almost 6 months to get done. If the details are so dirty, one must ask, why did Mayor Malchow, recognized as the deciding vote and spokesman of the opposition for this report, authorize such an exorbitant payout, close to $400,000? If the details are so dirty, why did Mayor Malchow provide a glowing letter of accomplishments to the city manager? Could it be that this payoff and letter were part of the gag order to prevent the city manager from having his hearing that he publicly requested on his own allegations against the Mayor Malchow and other council members for violations that had taken place against ethics, as well as handling of information, potential illegal actions against council members and against the city, putting it at risk? These past couple weeks saw the city continued embarrassment, not only in the Seattle Times, Cairo TV, Washington Council of Open Government, and even some of our local blogs. Malchow again says she wants to move on, and like last episode saga, doesn't want to look in the rear view mirror. Fellow council members rightly cited last week there was no moving on till this taxpayer report is released. What dirty details are so frightening that prevent its release to the citizens who paid for it? While you may feel you can stonewall the citizens, the press now is involved and will continue this story. With all the now public serious allegations that are being aired, similar investigations must take place into those allegations against Mayor Malchow and other council members. The citizens have paid for the city manager investigation and have a right to know. I also want to take a moment to applaud Councilmember Howe for her reminding the council that the citizens are the council's boss. In fact, the Washington State Constitution, Article 1, Section 1 states, all political power is inherent in the people and government derives their just powers from the consent of the governed. That is the
15
real
seconds.
bill. Stop Malchowgate, hold the council accountable, and provide transparent democratic governance in our city. We, the citizens, should not be asked to settle for less, nor should the council be providing less than that. That's what the oath you've sworn to uphold has been. Thank you very much. Gracias, and I look forward to seeing you all in person soon. Thank you.
I will now unmute the next caller. Mr. Gerund.
Thank you. Greetings, council members. My name is Don Jaron, and I've been a resident of Smamish since 1979, 20 years before incorporation. This evening, I'd like to speak to the Transportation Capital Improvement Plan and to the Smamish Parks programs. Regarding the TIP, it's about time to bring Smamish into compliance with state law after failing to pass a TIP update for the past couple of years. thereby losing out on chances for state and federal transportation project grants. I urge the council not to consider extra tax burdens for our residents, be it utility tax, transportation benefit district, or bonds. We have done very well as a city without any bonds for the first 23 years, and this is not the time to borrow from future generations to pay for unneeded projects. Regarding current revenue sources, I need only say that the assumption of 50 dwelling units per year is too conservative. Even 100 per year would give an extra $4 million over the 6-year period. A formal project prioritization might work well in the first draft, but then other considerations must be incorporated. Item number 4 on fiscal considerations would be where cost-benefit ratios should be considered, and this category should be weighted much more than 1.5x. If anything, it should be 3x or 4x, and no mega projects should be considered until the long-term benefits are truly compelling. Consider safe and complete transportation facilities with good cost-benefit ratios. Regarding the parks master plans, I'd like to compliment the city on Earth Day events, including the open house at Big Rock Park South. Anjali Meyer and other park staff, as well as the park commissioners, provided the public with a look at this awesome third part of Mary Piggott's donation to the city. With the garages, the barn, and the pool house, there are also possibilities for interim Smamish seniors usage for the 18,000 Smamish residents over age 50. I encourage council to also think creatively about possible use of the house in Big Rock North as an interim senior center. The master planning for this park and for Beaton Hill Park is a good opportunity for the public to weigh in. I received the Smamish Parks Recreation booklet in the mail recently. Well done, and I encourage the Smamish residents to take advantage of the wonderful amenities in the dozen Smamish public parks highlighted in this publication. Thank you for your service to the citizens of Smamish, and have a good evening.
I will now promote the next caller. Jan Bird.
There we go. Well, I also want to thank the city for the wonderful 2 events they had on Saturday, both the Earth Day event and the open house at Big Rock South. I don't think I've ever had as many people come to my booth as I did at this Earth Day. It was amazing. So thank you very much. And I also want to thank Mayor Malchow for being there. She was participated in a joint recognition ceremony for our new native plant stewards in the 2019 class, delayed many times because of COVID. And we did a recognition for them joint with the Washington Native Plant Society. And also we gave out our Native Plant Society annual awards. And out of them, all but one were given to Smamish related people. One was Anna Yorba, who's one of our new stewards who's worked at East Smamish Park and continues to work with me on refurbishing the Lower Commons Native Plant Garden and maintains the BPA right-of-way over in Klahani, has a native garden there as well. But also, we have both Chris Jordan and Sebastian Rataco from our Parks Department, both got joint awards as Professionals of the Year. So even people outside of Smamish, the ones that worked with them to do the Native Plant Steward Program, commented even a couple years ago about how wonderful the 2 of them were. We couldn't figure out which one to give it to. We had to give it to both of them. So that was a nice event. And then going over to Big Rock, and it was wonderful. You actually let us go into the park before it opened. I think that's kind of a first. And I'd like to suggest that maybe a couple times, especially during the late spring and summer and early fall, maybe once a month, have it open for several hours. You don't have to keep the buildings open, just have the property open so people can, walk it. because especially if it's going to be a multi-year process. As one of the people there, a friend of mine said, she said, I might be dead in 4 years, so it would be nice if we had the opportunity, a couple times a year to spend a few hours. People really enjoyed it. They had a great time. So thank you very much.
I will now promote the next caller. Mr. Stickney.
Good evening, City Council members. Paul Stickney, Smamish. Tonight I'm giving an extemporaneous comment, which is kind of scary for me, but I am going to cover some of the stuff I turned in today. I'd like to start with something I learned about back in the late 1970s, where a group of about 50 real estate agents in Missoula, Montana, almost came to blows in a marketing seminar when a guy gave a really awkward question and set it up for us. And he asked, how big is big and how small is small? You should have heard all of the diverse opinions and the anger and there was a lot of angst and frustration. And what we took out of it is context matters. So I'm going to move that story into one of the real major issues that you've heard me talk about often, which is the shape of the future and growth in the city of Sammamish going forward. One interesting fact, from 1980 through 1999, King County allowed 16,000 housing units to be built in Sammamish, including pipeline projects and the Klahani area. Sammamish, from 2000 to 2022, enabled about 3,300 housing units, including town center. That's roughly a 20% number. So how big is big? How small is small? But what I've been talking about and trying to share is it's not a question of how much was here in the past. It's more of a question is, for those that are here now, that are roughly 22,500 houses, what types of housing, different, diverse, smaller, and larger, do those folks need other than large single-family homes for unplanned and planned changes over their lives? Of course, not everyone's going to stay here, but a lot of people want to stay here. And as many callers have called out, there's darn good reason for that. It's a fantastic area to live. So it's interesting to also note a couple other facts. Of our 22,500 households in the community, roughly 3,000 have an average median income at 80% or less, and the other 19,000 have AMIs over 80% AMI. We've never done housing needs analysis.
15 seconds.
That are keeping us away is to learn what do 6/7 of those living in Sammamish need and want over lifetime, and comparing how potentially optimizing those needs could turn all the consequence wheels in Sammamish. Have a good evening. Appreciate the opportunity to speak.
Madam City Clerk, I just want to confirm that concludes all those.
Oh, we have one more
Perfect, thank
with their
you.
hand raised. So I will promote, this is a phone caller.
Saving the best for last, Mayor. James Eastman, Sammamish, Washington. I too look forward to turning to in-person next week. Also, would like to request that we go back to having open office hours. I feel like I know about half of the council, but all the new council members, I haven't even met everyone yet. So it would be nice if we could start switching off once a month if that's something you guys can accommodate. With that said, been driving home last week or two and have noticed that they are now starting the improvements at East Lake Smamish Parkway and Fall City Road. We know that those have been coming for a while now. And essentially, they're going to have a through lane, no more just right turn on red. It's going to be an open through lane. And you'd expect traffic to go up on the Parkway. You've heard me mention probably 3 or 4 times now why I am so against EIS number 4. Alternative 4 is because when we modeled that, we actually modeled traffic going down on the Parkway. And my reasoning for being against it was because they're putting the through lane in. Why wouldn't we model that? Well, they're putting the through lane in now, and we are still going through this EIS exercise, and our data is already bad because that through lane's going in. So if we're going to have these perceived outcomes before we even start or before we gather the right data, I would just ask that we take a step back and ask ourselves if that's the right thing to do. So for this TCIP, I'd like to see us focus on connections. I'm so out of shape that sometimes I bike up less steep roads. And one of the roads I bike up, the sign says future road connection. And I just get a chuckle because the sign has probably been there for 25 years and there's been no road connections. So I'd like to see us focus on connections. Also, the Emerald Necklace Trail, some of the trails that we've been talking about. If we could put some focus on those would be great. Thanks so much. Bye.
Madam City Clerk, is there anyone else desiring to give comment?
That appears to be all for public comment tonight. I will turn it back over to you, Mayor.
Perfect, thank you. So next we have the 2023 to 2028 Transportation Capital Improvement Plan Workshop. I'm going to turn this over to Jeff Elikish, among other staff members.
Thank you, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, council members, and City Manager. My name is Jeff Elikish. I am the Public Works Director. The purpose of tonight's agenda is intended to provide an overview of the Transportation Capital Improvement Plan, also referred to as the TIP. Our focus of this work session is on discussing reasonably anticipated revenues during the 6-year period, possibly new revenue sources that are available to the city, and to discuss potential project prioritization methods as it relates to the TIP. Our speakers tonight will include Senior Transportation Planner Doug McIntyre, myself, Deputy Finance Director Chris Giannini, and during Q&A, if Assistant City Manager Aaron Anton is available, and or Deputy Public Works Director Audrey Starcy can answer questions. So we got a team of people that can help out questions all night long. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Doug McIntyre. Doug.
Thank you, Jeff. Good evening, Mayor Malchow, members of the council. My name is Doug McIntyre, Senior Transportation Planning Manager for the Public Works Department. Can everyone see my screen fine? Okay, great, thank you. Okay, as has been mentioned, tonight we're in front of you for a discussion and workshop on the 2023-2028 Transportation Capital Improvement Program. As we are doing now, we are starting every presentation with just an overview of our division. So we are one of 7 divisions in the Public Works Department. We comprise 4 positions and currently 3 employees. That's myself, the management analyst, and the community transportation coordinator. Our work plan for 2022 is quite robust, and the Transportation Capital Improvement Program is one of the several things we have going for this year. For tonight, we have a really good discussion planned for the council. We're going to start with the revenue assumptions that we're using for planning for the TIP. We will then talk about other funding options, and that will be primarily led by Chris Giannini, our Deputy Finance Director. We will pause at that point to have a discussion and Q&A. Following that session, we will take a break. It's going to be probably a pretty long night, so want to make sure we get a little break in there. When we come back from the break, we will start with a discussion on the project prioritization element of the TIP, and then we are seeking direction on that piece as well from the council. So again, these are just some refresher slides. These were shown at the last presentation we had with council on the 12th of April. But just as a way to kind of continue to set the foundation for this, the TIP is required in the state of Washington. All cities must adopt a 6-year comprehensive capital transportation plan. It is updated annually, and it must be consistent with the comprehensive plan. It is also a planning level document, so it is not budgeting. It does not establish any expense authority on its own. The TIP is a requirement for grant funding eligibility. We are finding now that we're applying for grants more directly and more regularly that this is becoming something that's really important for us. And then also you'll notice, I'm just going to reiterate this from last presentation, but we are using the terminology Transportation Capital Improvement Plan, TCIP. It has generally been called a TIP in the past, but the Transportation Capital Improvement Plan is really an acknowledgement that this is our capital plan for transportation. We do not adopt a separate capital plan. But you will hear us refer to it as a TIP. Just please know that those are interchangeable terms for us. Again, just reiterating that the TIP plays a lot of roles for the city. It does a lot of different things, but primarily and kind of, in summary, it does 3 main functions. It is a way to show our transparency in how we invest in the system and how we plan to invest in the system. It identifies very clearly what those solutions are to our system needs and our problem areas. And then, of course, it outlines a time frame for estimating project completion. So funds are allocated to projects by year. I'm going to pause here and actually turn it over to Jeff before we jump into the next discussion point here. So Jeff, would you mind I'm going to stop sharing?
Thanks, Doug.
Yep, thank you.
So let me know when that comes up, please.
We can see it.
Great. As I said, thanks, Doug. The functionality of the TIP is basically a spreadsheet that represents policy direction of the City Council for a transportation plan to be potentially implemented over a 6-year period. As Doug said, it is a planning document. However, there are strings attached. The foundation of a 6-year TIP stems from the transportation element of the city's 2015 comprehensive plan. As mentioned earlier, our focus tonight is on reasonably anticipated revenues, which we'll get into here in just a second, long-term revenues and new possibilities, as well as prioritization. Our next workshop is on May 24th, and we plan to have a working draft of the 6-year TIP for 2023-2028. What you're seeing on the screen is an 11 by 17 sheet of paper. It's hard to read on the screen. I'm going to zoom into it, and we will also make copies available to the council. For those that were here last year when we started upon this, we had paper sheets. If I could do a 22 by 34, it would be perfect, because then I could put everything on it. But you'll have to bear with me. There's a ton of information, and we're trying to boil it down succinctly as we can. So in a moment, I'm going to zoom into this. Overall, our goal is to balance forecasted transportation project costs with reasonably anticipated revenue sources. So let me dive into the spreadsheet here just a little bit. In a sec. Let me see. Here we go. So what is in this spreadsheet, and what will you be seeing as things progress forward? First of all, you'll be getting a work in progress draft. It'll have a lot of information. There'll be sequential numbers for columns, sequential numbers for rows, so we can refer to things. We will list projects and programs with identification of likely groupings together. You're seeing this in column 1 at the moment. We have intersections, we've got programs, we've got corridors, things like that. As we progress across the page, you'll see at the top here, it says 1 and 6 and 7. I've got some hidden information at the moment that we will bring back to council. but these are qualifiers about the projects. Is it in the comprehensive plan? Is it traffic impact fee eligible? Is it stormwater eligible? And maybe some other qualifiers about the project. So we'll have some columns of information to help you understand each particular project. As we scroll down into this, the color coding has represent, green for being, good and likely, because we already have made commitments, and we will be talking about those as we dive into the projects later in the revenue sources. And then as we go further down, we get into optional projects, some regional projects that are on the list, and then are what I call long-range system completion projects. And many of these are also in the Bluma EIS document, which will be coming back to council on May 10th to talk about code and comp plan amendments. And so we'll have a deep dive into that whole aspect of it as we progress forward. So the other thing that you'll see as we progress the spreadsheet across is now we get into numbers. And there are lots of numbers. There's numbers for the year, the totaling of the year. There's total overall project costs. There's prior dollars spent. There's a forecast as to when we might spend money, and that's really tied to cash flow. And we'll get into that later when we go do a deeper dive into this. We'll have a total for the 6-year amount and anything that's future beyond the 6 year, because sometimes projects start but don't get completed in that 6-year window. They carry over. We'll have an accumulation numbers, and then which we're intended to talk mostly tonight about, is then we'll balance it to revenue. And tonight, in a moment here, Doug and Chris will dive into revenue streams that are possible, that are restricted in certain cases, and then what's the probability of receiving such revenue during the 6-year window. Last year, we attempted to qualify it by a high probability, a good probability, and a fair probability. And we'll talk about those kinds of things as Doug dives into it. But as you can see, these numbers here will attempt to balance the project expenses to the revenue assumptions. And when we run out of revenue, we run out of project. But if we want more projects, we'll need more revenue. And we'll either need to come from these sources or brand new sources. And I have other in red out here because there's a litany of those that we can go through when time allows. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Doug, just so that you'll get this spreadsheet in detail and all the things that go with it. But our focus tonight really is about the revenue aspect, so we can put boundaries around that so that we can frame the projects into those desired assumptions. And so with that, Doug, I'm going to turn it back to you.
All right, thank you, Jeff. Okay, so the first portion of the workshop tonight is on revenue assumptions, and there's a big caveat here that we wanted to make sure we emphasize. This is also a caveat in the agenda bill, but just to reemphasize for the viewing public that all figures that we're talking about in regard to revenue assumptions are work in progress. They are subject to change. And in fact, some of them have actually changed already between the presentation tonight and the agenda bill. So we apologize for that, but we're dealing with trying to refine these numbers and make sure that they're as accurate as possible. So we are still early in the process. So again, these numbers might change a little bit. So try to bear with us if you can. Okay, so this is just another snapshot of kind of, I don't want to reiterate what Jeff just said, but how it all comes together. We want to show everything being balanced, the revenues. So all the project costs are going to be balanced to the revenues. And it comes together in this larger spreadsheet that again, Jeff has talked about. And in particular for tonight, and this part of the discussion, we want to focus in on that top right portion of the spreadsheet, which is the reasonably anticipated revenue sources. So as you can see on this screen, we have the sources that Jeff highlighted a little bit ago. We have broken this down into what we call the high probability, the good probability, and the fair probability sources of revenue. So the high probability are things like the traffic impact fee, REIT dollars, that kind of thing. The things that the funds that we know we can really assuredly count on. The good probability are things like grants, where it is a competitive process, but we think we have a good shot at getting some money. We are using conservative estimates on those numbers, but we do think we can be pretty successful, for instance, on grants like the state TIB, the Transportation Improvement Board. And then there's less likely funding sources, and those are considered the fair probability sources. And that would be the federal grants and the storm utility portion funds there. Those we are just a little less sure about. but we still want to show that those are things that we could possibly rely on. And again, just to reiterate a point we made on the 12th of April in our last presentation, that the reason why this is important to this whole process is because once you show funding allocated to a project in the TIP, based on the code, that those projects are assumed to have reasonable financial commitments. And so then they are shown in the model as being completed within that 6-year window. So that is something that we want to be sure that everyone is understanding. And that's why we want to give the council options in terms of what they think about for funding assumptions. Again, high probability, good probability, and fair probability. So if you look at all of those together, the three, the good, the high, the good, and the fair, you get roughly $47.6 million. Again, these are rounded numbers, and this is slightly different than what was in the agenda bill. We apologize for that, but again, these numbers are still being refined. So we're looking at roughly $47.6 million to allocate to projects in the TIP. And that, again, is assuming the high, good, and fair probability funding. So I'm going to step through each of those, just kind of spend a minute or so on each of them to just make sure we all understand what we're talking about. So you notice that we did include a placeholder for general fund money. We were actually not assuming any dollars being allocated or being used from the general fund. So we just wanted to say that that is something we're not relying on. It is something that could be used, but for the purposes of the 2023-2028 TIP, we are not assuming dollars from the general fund. And then we step into the traffic impact fees. So these are fees that development pays proportionate to their impact to the system. We have at one point in time, I'm not sure if it is still currently, it could be, but it is or was the highest impact fee in the state. We charge around $14,000 per trip based on a project's impact to the system. We're assuming over the 6-year window that we've averaged out about 50 single-family residential 50 new units per year. So we're using some rough math here to get us to how much dollars we can assume in the 6-year window of new traffic impact fees. We will also be accounting for traffic impact fee funds that we currently have already received from development. And together those equal about $12.1 million. So that's, again, rounded. The kicker with traffic impact fees is that there are a lot of restrictions around the funding. For instance, the city can only hold the funds for a certain amount of time, roughly 10 years, unless it's extended for extraneous or for other reasons. And also, TIF money can only be used for certain projects. So, and even further, certain portions of certain projects. And so we can get into that a little bit deeper if you'd like to, but there are a lot of restrictions on TIF funds. So again, 12.1 million assumed for TIF. And then another high probability source of funding is our real estate excise tax. That's the REIT. We are averaging about $3 million per year in this funding source. And if you extrapolate that over the 6 years, that is $18 million assumed in the TIP. And then there are, in this case, we have received a state direct appropriation under the state's budgeting process. The Lewis Thompson Road received a $3 million grant from the state. So we are assuming that money is in this program, and that work is begun. These are getting into now the good probability sources of funding. So we're assuming through the King County Flood District that we would be eligible for around $800,000 in flood reduction grants for particularly 2 projects. Again, the LTR project, Lewis Thompson Road, and Issaquah City Road, the portion that floods, not the entire corridor. We know that is not a project that's moving, but there is a portion that floods right in front of Endeavor Elementary School. And then, of course, the TIB grants, we think that we can be successful in a few different areas here. We're assuming for Lewis Thompson Road, we're assuming the intersection at 228th and Southeast 40th, as well as Issaquah Pound Lake Road Phase 1. Those are all projects that we think have a good shot in being competitive in that process. And together, we're assuming $5 million there. And then this is getting into the lower probability, the kind of fair probability source of funding. So federal grants, these are the Surface Transportation Program grants. And these you have to apply through PSRC. These are much more competitive. They tend to be more regional in nature. And so it's a little bit harder to get these funds. But nonetheless, we can assume that we could potentially be successful on about a $3 million grant here. And then, of course, the storm portion, the stormwater utility fee portion of transportation projects. So this is not to say that all the money from the storm fee is used for transportation projects, but it can be used for the stormwater component of a transportation project, if that makes sense. We're assuming about 5.7 million in this one. There is a caveat here. We are going to be embarking on the stormwater utility rate study, so that will discuss policies around how that money is allocated. So there's some more work to be done there, but just keep that in the back of your mind. So I want to just kind of summarize again, showing you what we're looking at for the revenue assumptions. If you took all of the high, good, and fair probability funding, you're looking at about 47.6 million. If you look at just high and good probability, you're at about 38.9 million. And then the high probability only funding is around 33.1 million. Again, these are round numbers, and these are likely to change a little bit by the time we come back to you next time. But we want to give you some kind of the meat to work with. So are there any questions on revenue assumptions?
Let me give council just a second to raise their hands if they have any questions.
Sure, no problem.
I don't see hands, but I think I have a question. Okay, Councilmember Lamb does as well. Okay, Councilmember Lamb.
I was looking at, there was the part on the traffic impact fees. It's based on 50 single family.
Yes.
How was 50 determined?
Last year, oh, go ahead, Doug.
Go ahead, Jeff. Yep.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I think we might be saying the same thing. So hopefully, I think Jeff was about to say, last year when we were putting this together, we talked to our Department of Community Development Director, David Pyle, and we looked at permit data and averaged out the average on an annual basis to get to the 50 number. Jeff, is that, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, that was the basis of it. It is a conservative number. It could be more. One thing that I'll, as you mentioned also, Doug, and for benefit of the council members, the traffic impact fees are restricted, and we only have one project at the moment, maybe two possibly, that would be eligible to spend those funds. So we have to be very careful. Yes, we can raise more money, but can we spend it given the balancing of the proportionate share of a project? Some of these projects are 50% eligible, some of them 25%, some of them could be 80 or 90%, but they're kind of few and far between at the moment. Once we do code and comp plan amendment, we plan to bring back an update to the traffic impact fee program to reflect current projects at that time. At least that's the current schedule that we're in. So just a little bit more context, if that's helpful.
Thank you, Jeff.
So I have a question as well. This one relative to REIT and the assumptions built in on REIT. What years did we use to determine the average?
Let's see. I think trying to think. I know we had worked with our finance department on those figures. I don't know if maybe when Chris gets on the line, if she could help us answer that question, but I don't know the exact years. I just know that was, we did look at the average on the, we came up with $3 million on average annually. I don't know is Chris on the line?
Yeah, she's there.
Yeah, the reason I ask and the reason I think it's important is I think when we're making assumptions on revenue and then we are looking at spending taxpayer money for projects is that our assumptions should be as airtight as they possibly can, lest we end up spending more and then we have a revenue gap. So one of the reasons that I'm asking specifically about REIT is that it's been somewhat recent that REIT was tiered based on sales price. And you pay a greater percentage of REIT when you go over a certain threshold. I think one of those thresholds is $1.5 million. There's another tier that goes over $3 million. And so real estate values in the last 12 months have skyrocketed as well. And so I don't, no one has a crystal ball in terms of knowing what the market will be like in subsequent years, but interest rates are on the rise. We're likely to see potentially fewer homes being sold. And so that's why I'm trying to understand what assumptions are built into this $3 million average and what years were used.
If we're not able to answer tonight, we'll bring that back to you or send a memo out with that. I can't remember if it was a 7-year rolling average over the last 7 years, but I know it was an average of past data. And at the moment, Public Works gets roughly 50% of that by policy. And it's split between us and Parks. And there's also a policy discussion. Does that need to be changed? Does facilities, other things need to be included, so forth and so on. But we can dig that detail back up so that you have more confidence in how we calculated that number.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful, especially based on the tiering for REIT, which is somewhat recent per my recollection. So
we'll get that to you, Mayor.
Perfect, thank you.
And team.
Okay, I don't see any more hands up. And just for the record, Councilmember Moran has now joined us.
Okay, great, thank you. Need some feedback there.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, that's Councilmember Moran coming online. She'll get it. Hang on.
I think she deserves 25 cents in the jar, just saying.
Okay, are we good? Okay, sounds like we're good. Okay, so I'm gonna turn over the slides to Chris Giannini, our Deputy Director of Finance. She's gonna go over the next 10 or so slides.
Okay, am I on?
Yes, we can hear you, Chris.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm going to go over the transportation project funding options that we have. I'm going to start with small projects or money we might spend on debt service funding. And some of the examples of small projects are intersection improvements and ongoing programs like sidewalks, street lighting, school safety zones. I'll be talking about the estimated amount of revenue we can get per year, how available it might be, the cost per household, if there's a vote needed, and if there's a cost to the city for that type of revenue. So if you want to move on to the next slide, Doug. Great, we'll start with REIT. Christy, I believe that REIT tiering is on the state portion of REIT, but we can check on that and see. So the estimated annual revenue for REIT is $3 million, and over the past 10 years, the annual average has been $3.16 million, and this is for the transportation share. Half of it goes to parks and half of it goes to transportation. Last year we collected, half of it was $5.7 million. So we're counting on 3, that's what we've been getting for the last 10 years average. It's available over the course of the year, so we collect some each month. It's not available all at once. There's no cost per household as taxes on the property sales. No votes required, and there's no additional cost to administer this. We already get this tax. It's collected by King County, and they send it to the city once a month. Next slide. Next is a transportation benefit district, which would be new to Smamish. The 2 most common types of revenue for transportation benefit districts are car tab fees or sales tax. So the council can initiate a $20 car tab fee for the first 2 years, and $40 car tab fee for years 3 and 4, go up to $50 in the 5th year, and that's as high as the council can go without a vote. We can collect, we estimate between $900,000 per year and $2.25 million per year from the car tabs. The sales tax, about $1.4 million per year on the sales tax option. The availability of this, it can take up to 6 months to a year to set up a transportation benefit district. We estimate it would cost per household between $40 and $100 per year if you had 2 cars, and that's going from year 1 at $20 per car to year 5 at $50 per car. There is a vote required on the sales tax option that has to go to the voters. They can put that in place for 10 years. They can add another 10-year time frame after that, but the maximum at this time is 20 years on the sales tax option. On the car tab option, if council sets the fee over $50 and up to 50, or over 40 and up to $50, it can be challenged by referendum. The fee can be raised to more than $50 per car, up to $100 by a vote of the people. There is a cost to administer this. We would have to have a staff or consultant time to set up and collect the funds from the Transportation Benefit District. Next slide. Next, we have utility tax. The estimated annual revenue for this is 1.3 to 1.8 million per year for each 1% of tax. And the difference is depending what utilities you want to tax. If we don't tax, I believe it's water and sewer, we're at the 1.3 million. So these are just rough estimates. We don't really know how much each household is going to use or how much tax it's going to bring in, but this is our estimate based on looking at other cities that have utility taxes. It will be available about 6 months after you decide you want to do it. So you have to pass an ordinance. It takes 60 days for the ordinance to go into effect and is typically collected quarterly. The estimated cost per household would be between $60 and $81 per year per 1% of tax, depending what utilities were taxed. There's no vote required, but it is subject to referendum. So the voters could put it on the ballot and vote it down even after the council has said they want to collect the utility tax. There is a cost to administer the utility tax, and we may need additional staff or to contract with an outside firm to actually collect the tax and identify all the utilities that should be paying the tax. There is a caution on this one. The utility tax is one of the few revenue sources available to fund operations. It may be needed to address expected future operating deficits. Next slide. These are just a couple of small revenue sources that may be used. You could transfer money from the general fund, and Doug had mentioned that earlier. They haven't assumed any amount. That would be totally council option based on the budget. Or occasionally we have mitigation fees, and these are sporadic revenue sources that vary based on mitigation agreements. They may be available to spend on anything, or they may be restricted to projects, particular projects. There's no cost per household, no vote is required, and there's no cost to administer, or very little cost. Next slide. Moving on to funding the larger projects, we have bonds, transportation impact fees, public works trust fund loans, grants, tax increment financing, and estate appropriation. I'll talk a little bit about each of those. Next slide. So voter approved bonds, also known as unlimited tax general obligation bonds, would require a 60% voter approval. And in the vote, the voters agree to increase their property taxes to make the debt service payments. And that extra tax would end when the bonds are paid off. It would be a guaranteed source of funds for debt repayment, and you would have voter approval of the projects to be funded, which you have to designate when you issue the bonds or when you have the vote. The estimated revenue is any amount up to the city's debt limit of $600 million. We could issue the bonds probably within 6 months to a year, depending on the timing of the vote. And the estimated cost per household would depend on the size of the bond issuance. Next slide. Council managed votes or non-voted votes are also non-voted bonds are also called limited tax general obligation bonds. These can be issued by the council without any vote, so no voter approval is required, but you would need to allocate current funds to debt service payments. You could set up a transportation benefit district, have a utility tax, cut services, or find money somewhere else, but you do need to pay the debt service. The estimated debt service payment on a $20 million bond issue with a 20-year repayment is about $1.2 million per year, just to give you an idea what the debt service would be. Estimated revenue on this is any amount up to the city's debt limit of $360 million for non-voted bonds. It's less than for the voted bonds. It would take about 3 to 6 months before we could issue the bonds, and there would be no cost to the household unless you enact a utility tax or a transportation benefit district for the debt service payments. Next slide. So this is the impact fees. Doug had talked a little bit about this earlier. So the 10-year annual average of impact fees is 2.34 million, but we only collected 424,000 in 2021. So this really varies depending on development. Impact fees are charged on the development that will increase vehicle trips. And as Doug mentioned, the use is restricted to qualifying projects identified in the traffic impact fee study. The last impact fee study that was adopted by council, I believe, was in 2014. And we are currently holding $7.9 million of impact fees pending construction of the limited eligible projects that Jeff mentioned, Issaquah Pine Lake Road, Sahali Way, and East Lake Smamish Parkway, Southeast 24th Street intersection, which I don't believe is even on the tip or has been discussed recently that I know of. Next slide. Public Works Trust Fund loans might be available from the Public Works Board at low interest rates. The availability of these depends on the amount the Public Works Board has to loan and how Sammamish fares in competition with other applicants. This would require debt service payments, and the city has taken out a Public Works Trust Fund loan in the past for the renovation of 228th at 0.5% interest. We made the final debt service payment last year. Next slide. State and federal grants are available, as I believe Doug talked about, and the estimated revenue would depend on the grant award. For state and federal grants, the city needs to pay the project costs first, and then we get reimbursed with the grant. We can get reimbursement as we go along, but we need to have funds available to do the construction. There's no cost per household, no vote required, no repayment obligation, and they typically pay for only a part of the project. Next slide. I've included tax increment financing because it's new. It was approved in 2021. I thought some of you might have heard of it. I don't believe it's an option for Sammamish. We'll talk a little bit about it. So a TIF, it's an increase in the property taxes levied in an established tax increment area that is dedicated to paying for improvements in that area. Some considerations are it takes a year to establish a tax increment area, and construction in the area cannot start for 5 years after the TIA, tax increment area, is established. The assessed valuation of the TIA can't be more than the lesser of $200 million or 20% of the total city assessed valuation. Sammamish's total 2021 valuation was $24 billion. So we'd be talking about a very small tax increment area if we can't go over 200 million. And the law requires many steps and project commitments that would be difficult or impossible to implement in Sammamish. If you want more information about the tax increment financing, I have lots of information if you have questions. But I just brought this up because it was a new law passed in 2021. Next slide. So this is the state appropriation. I think Jeff referred to this recently, or Doug, that the state legislature can appropriate funds for transportation projects in addition to their established funding programs. And the amount and availability would be subject to ad hoc legislative action. Next slide. And this is the last slide. It's just a table of the various funding sources, the revenues, and all the things I talked about all on one page. So do you have any questions?
Chris, let me give folks just a second to put their hand up if they have questions here. I don't see hands, but I'm going to ask a question based on some of the information in the slides, because Councilmember Lamb had asked a previous question on how we arrived at 50 dwelling units on the assumptions for revenue sources, and I did some quick math. I didn't have the exact impact fee, but I think it was 14 and some change. So the 10-year average then would be 166 dwelling units. Last year would have been 30. And I'm assuming that's a product of moratoria that we've had on, and it takes a couple years to kind of have that kind of catch up, because typically once an applicant makes an application, it can take a couple years for it to actually go through once they're vested. So I only point that out because 50 then seems really ultra conservative, given that we don't have a moratorium on at all, and we've been, the 10-year average has been 166. Is that a fair assumption on my part? That 50 is pretty conservative?
Are a little bit tricky to figure out, because just because there's a permit doesn't mean that they had to pay the traffic impact fee right then.
Yep.
And several years ago, they could pay them in percents. So they would pay a certain percent at different phases of construction. So if they hadn't used a permit where they initially had paid part of the impact fee, they might be paying part of the impact fee now. That doesn't happen as much as it used to be. It's very hard to figure out. You just take 50 homes and multiply it by 14,000. See, that's what you're going to get this year.
Okay. Yeah, it seems like it's probably fairly conservative. I mean, it's always good to be more conservative than not, but and then just another observation on some of these, and somewhat for the benefit of the newer council members, which is some of these options for revenue sources are concerning for me, because if they're subject either to voter approval or referendum, making assumptions that those will not be subject to referendum or that the voters would pass them. And if we put them in our capital plans to do, and then those get put into the model, that makes assumptions based out in the development community that when an application comes in, that project's already done. And if we then don't have the revenue because it's subject to referendum, that is a slippery slope, in my opinion. So those don't feel very comfortable to me. So, Councilmember Howe.
Thank you, and thank you for the work on this, because this is really helpful for me to understand the potential funding sources. What would also be helpful for me is to understand, based on the research that you folks have done, because clearly you've done extensive research here, I'd love to know kind of what our sister cities look like with these funding sources. I'm assuming that there's, if this is the list of possible options, I'd be curious to know if we have any idea what other cities have used and have found success with to some extent in terms of that meeting their goals, like to your point, Mayor Malchow, about the potential of the funding source. Like how many of our sister cities have actually taken up the vote to actually do one of these larger ticket items, for example. So that's, I don't expect anybody to have an answer to that right this second, but that's something I'd love to understand, just kind of what the history and the context is for that. Something else that I can remember from a few years ago, Senator Hasagawa had really pushed forward a land trust or a land bank in Washington State, which never happened. But out of curiosity, does anybody know if there's any incentive for that to come back or to be a real thing ever? Or is it more the public works is where we would get our big loan from?
Looks like Jeff's got his hand up.
I don't have an answer to that question. We can look into it.
That is a great question. I know in my past life at another agency, we relied on that to some extent. I'd have to go back and research it further. It's been a while. We have not talked about it in the last 2 years at Smamish as an active thing, but it's something that we can research and see where that is. The other two things that you talked about in terms of sister cities and what they're doing, there is a list of agencies that are using the Transportation Benefit District, both sales tax, voter approved, non-voter approved. There's a big list out there. There is a list that shows who's doing what with that. I'm very familiar with that one. And then the other funding stream, utility taxes. Utility taxes are, as Chris mentioned, some of them are used for capital and some of them are used for operating. And depending upon the challenges associated with that, we'll have to see if we can, obtain that information and that distinguishment.
Thank you for that. And I had just one more question to help me understand. I could have sworn on one of the slides it said that we had collected funds and were holding them. I thought once you had them, you had to use them within 6 years. Is there a clock on that or not?
10. It's 10.
There is. It's 10 years.
Okay.
You have to spend them within 10 years.
All right. Thank you.
But there are some caveats to that 10 years too, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, I'm
Yes,
seeing
you
head
can
nods.
extend it if you have, I can't remember exactly what all the rules are, but if you have a project that you've already budgeted and you have a contracted, or if the council intends to build a project, for sure, you can hold them longer than that.
Okay, I don't see any more questions.
Thank you, Council. I'll jump in here and thank you, Chris. I really appreciate all the detailed information on the revenue options here. The next slide it says break. However, before I show that slide, I just want to check in with Council on the assumptions that we're making currently thus far in the process. We will, as Jeff mentioned in the beginning, we will be coming back to Council on May 24th with another workshop where we will talk about projects. But we just want to make sure that our assumptions so far are on track. And if there are any concerns, because it will help us produce a better document to talk about on the 24th of May. So if there are any concerns about what we're showing so far in terms of the assumptions for revenue, the sooner the better. If it's not tonight, then maybe this week or something, that would be helpful.
Councilmember Howell.
Thank you. You know, this is exactly the kind of information I would love to get public feedback on. And is there an opportunity to kind of vet this with the public? The surveys aren't awesome, but it would be better than nothing. And to get a sense of just what the appetite is for some of these projects. Of course, you'd have to associate the money with the project, otherwise it's kind of meaningless. And it kind of goes back to, you know, and show a picture. So it's a picture, it's a project, it's a price tag. And I would love to know what the public would think about some of these options, to get a feel for where they want to put their money. It's a way of trying to incorporate them into the budgeting process to some extent, if there was any way to do that at all.
The current plan, as we've laid it out and has been tradition, is we obtain revenue parameters, if you will. We put then a project list together to see if it's balanced. And then we go out to the public for a public hearing. And the public hearing, as we've currently scheduled it, is to occur likely in June with the intention of adopting in July. However, if the council wants a different process, then we would need to understand that and how the public involvement would be earlier rather than later. You know, what we need from the council ideally is those initial assumptions. Are we on track? I understand the desire. It would be helpful to have, you know, public weigh-in, but at the same token, the policy guidance, you know, comes from the council, and it's a balancing act between the public and you know, the duties of the council there. So I guess I turn that back to the council for how they want to proceed. If we choose to extend the process, it just means that now we're into August, September, possibly, if we're trying to weave in some kind of public element that we haven't done before. And I don't know what that looks like yet. And we have budget coming up and so forth. So I'm not trying to get out of it, but I'm just trying to say that there are consequences of a procedure and policy, and we're on board subject to the will of the council.
Right, and to kind of piggyback on what you just said, I mean, I think there's opportunity to educate and kind of bring the public along in your process, so that not disrupting your current process, not altering policy, but maybe there's an opportunity to invest in the public this type of education and knowledge, so that when it starts to hit June, you actually have actionable commentary in that time frame. So I'm looking at it more as an opportunity to educate, I guess. I wonder if that's a possibility.
Councilmember Trine.
Doug, can you go to, I think it's slide 19 or page 19, what revenue assumptions? So your high probability only 33 million, is that the green?
That is correct, yes.
That's the green, right? Okay, yes. I'm all right with that. I think you're on the right track when you start looking at the high probability that money is actually going to be in pocket. And I understand my fellow council members with the number of 50. So, I mean, if that's 60, if that's 80, that doesn't matter to me. I like the idea. You guys are headed in the right direction, that the high probability revenue assumptions is going to be around $33 million. Okay, so then the brown is the good probability, right?
Yes. The first two in the brown, that would be the flood reduction grant and the TIB, the Transportation Improvement Board.
Thank you for that clarification. And that would be an additional about $5 million, 5.8, almost 6. Those ones, okay, a little more concerned. There's obviously, you guys did too. That's why you called it only good. But I'm okay with saying, okay, if that money didn't come through, could we figure out a way to find an additional $5.8 million? Welcome to Smamish City Manager. That would be something he'd need to help us work through, and the finance department. But I'm okay with the high and the good probability. The last two, that's where I get a little bit, I wouldn't want to guarantee that I could, find another, what do you got there? 10, 13, there's a lot of money there. So so I would just say that at that point, I would be a little more cautious in my predictions of what would be anticipated that we could get that kind of money over the 6 years. I would just lean towards a more cautious approach on that reasonable part of the revenue assumption. And then my fallback then is to say the reason, because if I can't guarantee or have a pretty good feel that I'm going to get that kind of revenue, then that's why I would personally be looking at what other revenue sources from, now we go to the other list. Okay, are we going to go with councilmatic bonds? Are we going to go out to the voters and ask for money? Are we going to do a utility tax? Are we going to do it on a license, tab type of thing? So that's where I would pick up that additional $10 to $13 million to set a 6-year budget of TCIP projects at about $50 million or $47 million. Is that pretty clear, Doug, where my position is, or Jeff? You got a pretty good idea where I'm coming from on the revenue assumptions? I'm good with the top two, not so good with the third one, and would prefer to look at other revenue sources to make up the difference.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Back to you, Madam Mayor.
Okay, so along the same lines on revenue assumptions, I recall several years ago having a debate over assumptions in our tips and what was reasonably assumed to be kind of safe when we were making assumptions about what we were going to build, how much we were going to spend. I am totally uncomfortable with everything that is in that. Hold on, I got to go back to what it says. Fair probability. There's no way I'm going to bank on getting that money. It will be nice if we get it, but I think it's an unreasonable assumption to assume that we will get it. The good probability still leaves me a little concerned that, maybe we'll get them. They'll be nice if we do, but I don't know that I'm going to bank everything on a good probability when there's a high probability bucket there, which, we have assumptions there that may somewhat be on the conservative side. I think, those are all good assumptions. And I think getting that better understanding on REIT and the assumptions on the numbers that Councilmember Lamb asked about earlier. But I'm always reluctant based on our history of assumptions in revenue for going for anything other than what we pretty much know we are going to have in our pocket.
Thank you.
Councilmember Howell.
Part of where I'm trying to figure out on the low, medium, and high scale here is that it's harder for me to kind of assign probability. So I'm curious if you kind of mentally had already done this. Like in a sales opportunity, I would say a high probability is where I have a 75% chance of closing a sale. Reasonable to good might be 65%. I look at it more in terms of numerical percentages because it gives me a feeling of comfort, whether it's real or not, of just how close are we to really maybe making that nut or making that number. So I tend to be skew more conservative. I think I echo a bit of Mayor Malchow here in terms of high and good. I feel reasonable about I feel okay about, as long as we're kind of talking about it's an over 65% shot at getting the money.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And oh, Jeff, go ahead. You're muted, Jeff.
Yeah, go ahead, Doug. You first, and then I'll back up.
Okay, I'll just maybe make a minor point before turning it over to Jeff, which is when talking about probability, as you stated it, Councilmember Howe, I think that's where the grants come into play, where we start thinking, okay, we might have a 65% shot at getting this money. I think that's really where that kind of probability comes into play. The other high revenue or high probability sources, REIT and TIF, we do receive that money. It's more about how much of it are we receiving. So it's kind of a different question, different flavor of the question, I guess you could say. And I'll turn it over to Jeff now.
I think you're spot on, Doug. I would say that the reason that we're squeamish a little bit about a regional federal grant, we just made application, or we're making application based on council direction for Southeast 8th and 212th. We're hopeful, but that'll be a great benchmark for us, given that it's a town center related type project and it fits the category. How did it compete? Right now, I'm hopeful, but to give it a high probability or a good probability, I can't do that at the moment just because we don't have a track record in that regard. However, TIB, we did build and got a TIB grant for Southeast 4th, and it's a great project. And so Southeast 8th and 218th are similar qualifying projects. And so that's why we put that grant funding as a good, because we think in the next 6 years, we have a good shot at, obtaining funding, towards that, and or one of the other projects that we have listed. But we have not assigned numerics explicitly. There's kind of this track record over time that, you can kind of look at and, you kind of put the thumb up and go, yeah, I think it's about that. And, it's a scientific swag, I guess that's, it's the best guess that we can make. Lastly, I will say on the stormwater utility, it has been past council policy and in the comprehensive plan to assign utility capital dollars to transportation projects. But because the need in the utility is really high, and there's the retrofit strategies and the basin plans and all of those things, we're not certain with the council where that's going to land going forward. And so if I were in another agency, I would put it in the high probability because it's rock solid and we're going forward. However, we haven't updated the capital CIP plan yet for storm utility, and we're doing a rate study. And so therefore I kind of put it back in that lower category for now. But it is a policy direction of the council to weigh in. Do you want to assign 5%, 10%, X% of transportation project funding from the utility to help pay for those projects? We just haven't gotten that ratified with the council yet. So that's why it sits there kind of on the end. Hopefully that's helpful as well.
I just want to check in with the council members that haven't verbalized anything on this particular topic to make sure that they are having their voices heard as well. Deputy Mayor Clark, Councilmember Moran.
I'm good. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Councilmember Moran, all good?
Yeah, I think my comment on assumptions hasn't changed from my annual comment on it. I think they're just really tough. I can say that, the high probabilities, yeah, I'm totally good with those. But I'm pretty similar to Councilmember Treen, and that, when it comes to the good probabilities or the fair probabilities, I get a little bit more nervous. And so I think that's when, we would need to see a little bit more of, comparison of what else you're competing against and that sort of thing.
So I really quickly just looked back for language, and I was able to find it in, ironically, one of our own packets. And this is where I think it's just a good reminder as far as reasonable assurances. And it says, concurrency requires that improvements or strategies are in place at the time of development, or that a financial commitment is in place to complete the improvements or strategies within 6 years. Financial commitment is defined in GMA as sources of public or private funds or combinations thereof have been identified, which will be sufficient to finance public facilities necessary to support development, and that there is a reasonable assurance that such funds will be timely put to that end. And that's out of the whack. So again, I think that's where the reasonable assurances is we don't have a reasonable assurance that some of these other ones are going to actually come in, and that might leave a funding gap, and that's just where I don't feel comfortable. Jeff.
To summarize, I would what I heard, consensus of the council is high probability, no question. Good probability. Let me see it and see what it looks like. I want to, see what projects are going to kind of weigh against that, and if there's any more statistical or confidence information that we can do. The fair probability ones, that we would park those off to the side and either look at new possibilities or draw the line, and this is what we can afford based on that. So we'll have to come back and decide, do we what can we fit within that bucket, and does that work? The other thing is we'll take another look at the traffic impact fees, and while we were conservative at 50 trips per year, we'll go back and talk with DCD, look at the averages and maybe increase those, but recognize that it has caveats in terms of what it can be paid for. So we'll bring that back to you. I think that's what I've heard. Oh, and then lastly, what can we do for public involvement along the way? And I want to scratch our head with our team and see if there's something that we can do. It may be putting this information on the website. It may be some other things that gets to Councilmember Howe. And public input is great to have. So I don't know how to do that yet, but we'll scratch our heads and see if we can come up with something. So,
Councilmember Lamb.
I was curious about the possible sources of revenues that Chris had brought up. In the past, have there been items that have had serious discussion? Or I'm just curious as to what kind of conversations have happened in the past about the possible revenue sources. There was one on car license tab fees and some of the other ones. I can't remember.
One of the challenge, if I may, and then I'll defer back to you, Mayor, and the council members, but I will add that during the past 2 years, we took an extremely conservative approach and only budgeted enough of the projects to stop or hold, subject to what we were doing with the EIS. We have it queued up to give you a full-blown presentation on the Transportation Benefit District. It's sitting there. I mean, Chris did a good job highlighting it, but we didn't talk about what you could use it for. You might want to use it for instance, the overlay program or a portion of the overlay program, either operating or the capital side. You want to use it for capital projects. We have not engaged the council in the last 2 years that I've been here explicitly on that, but we're prepared to do so. In terms of utility taxes, I think we've skirted around that. But again, in the past 2 years, we have not launched anything in that direction, waiting the outcome of the Blooming EIS, quite frankly. And now that we're done with that and we're headed towards code and comp plan amendments, presuming that we stay the course on that, there's a list of projects. And if those projects are sustained, then we will need to come back and look at, well, how and when do we fund those and what tools do we use? But, Chris, do you have some other thoughts in terms of historically when we've had conversation on the various taxes, and maybe Mayor being the stalwart here?
I don't recall any serious discussions about any of the various sources. They've been brought up, as you said, and discussed kind of superficially, but no real serious discussions about them that I recall.
Yeah, I would concur with Chris on that. We haven't needed to garner funds of that nature, so there wasn't really much reason for council to deep dive on any of them.
I see Councilmember Treen's hand.
Yep, Councilmember.
Thank you. Just one really quick comment there, Jeff. You made the comment about storm water and retrofitting, and I think based on the information that you received at the retreat, that would still be a high priority, and moving forward, if your staff is willing to do more of that work, and how does that balance out when we come to budget time? What are we going to fund? What are we willing to pay for? I think that's really important, because it's not just, it's also the road projects create their own stormwater runoff. And so we have to mitigate for that as a city if we're building roadways or improving even sidewalks or connectivity or any number of projects that would be part of our TCIP. So if you keep moving that thing forward, I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Just a couple comments, and I'd like Audrey to, I guess, back me up on this. One strategy that we haven't talked about related to stormwater, but you can effectively have your stormwater start and pay for the design towards one of these capital projects, and at least it seeds the project to get it shelved to be competitive or to see what it truly costs, because a stormwater capital project for one of these corridors can run 20, 30, 40% of the total project cost. On a $30 million, that's a big chunk of change, right? But we could, by policy, use a lesser amount to get some of these projects started. So I just wanted to throw that that's one thing that can be done. Secondarily, I'd like Audrey to talk about the upcoming rate study, the capital plan, and how that's going to unfold. So you'll see that, but I think it's worthy of sharing. Audrey?
Yeah, something that we will be looking at as part of the rate study, along with the long list of stormwater projects, the retrofits and different things that have come out of the basin plan and the retrofit strategy. Some projects that still may be remaining on our capital list to accomplish will be the stormwater's cost share component of the transportation project. So we have pulled aside on this slide a few a few projects that are primarily stormwater based, if you will. So the flooding around Endeavor Elementary on Issaquah Falls City Road, that section of that project is more of a flooding project. So that would likely have a higher percentage that would be paid for from the 438 fund from stormwater versus maybe a different project that may start in transportation may have a smaller amount that may be funded by the stormwater utility, because that component of the transportation project is smaller. So we do have the option through policy guidance of selecting a contribution amount from the utility based on a percentage, as Jeff was talking about, where we can look at more of a project by project basis and look at the true cost share for the stormwater or from the utility to the transportation project, if that makes sense as well. And we'll have an opportunity to take a little bit deeper dive through the rate study in the next few months and what that could look like.
Audrey is sorry if I'm interrupting here and out of line. I don't mean to be. Is it all right, Mayor Malchow, if I speak?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry. Audrey, so is this something, when you say policy, can you be a little more clear on what you mean by that? Like is that something that we as a council need to pass policy that says, yeah, you can use these fees, or we can take REAP money and spend it on stormwater? What do you mean by that?
Chris can jump in and help me here, but there are the stormwater utility fund, it's an enterprise fund. It can only be spent on certain things. I guess when I was talking about policy, I was talking about how we would like to utilize the stormwater funding for the true cost share of transportation projects. So some cities choose to apply a flat percentage across the board to their transportation projects, and some choose to dive into the details a little bit more and have a project by project allocation. I don't think there's any cities that do not fund a portion of their transportation projects from the utility, but we could look into that. I know our consultants would have that answer, and Chris might even have that answer as well.
Thank you for
Right
that
now-
clarification.
And right now in our issue papers from the last rate study, we can have the choice. So if council would like to narrow that choice down so it's not as flexible, we can certainly look at that this year.
Thank you. That's all, Mayor.
So I have one additional question, and that is the traffic impact fee itself. My recollection is in all the time that I've been on the council, it has not changed. And my understanding is the traffic impact fee is calculated based on what is in your tip. And so I would love to see that calculation so that we can understand if we can adjust that up.
That's a great comment there. We do have the last rate study that was traffic impact fee study that was done in 2014. We can bring that back and show what was in it. And we're looking at what projects still apply or don't apply. But we do need to take also a look at, assuming that we're going forward with other projects, the Bloomer projects, then how does that affect the utility rates? It's not the utility, but the traffic impact fee as well. So there's room to move, but I don't know what it is, and so we'll have to bring that back to you.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful because when we're talking about revenue sources, if we can move the needle on the impact fees, that lessens the burden on the existing residents that are already here.
We will take a look at that and see what information we can discern and share that with the council.
Perfect. I don't see any more hands up. Do we want to take that built-in break that they had?
Please.
Yeah, okay. I'm hearing please. So yes, we'll just take a break and we'll be back 5 or so minutes. Houses. Birdhouses, painting birdhouses. Okay, I think we're back here. So we'll get rolling. We don't see Kent Dream, but we've got Karen.
When we start, it'll be led by Doug McIntyre on this one.
Okay.
Don't talk for a minute.
I think we're ready to roll, Doug.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. Welcome back, everyone. So the second part, or the second biggest part of the presentation tonight, is on project prioritization. You may recall from the 12th of April presentation, we did ask council if they wanted to add in a component of prioritization in a more explicit way in the TIP, and the answer was yes. So we are here to provide some more details on what you could possibly do and some suggestions on how to proceed on this. So before we get into some of those details, though, we did want to just kind of set the stage and say that there are some boundaries on what needs to be in the TIP. Obviously, the two biggest components of the TIP are the funding and the projects. So now talking about the projects, the TIP really has to include the concurrency failures in our system. We have to be addressing those. That is a requirement of the GMA. We do need to show how we plan to remedy any failures in our system based on the level of service that we're using at the time. We also have a federal mandate to do ADA compliance. That's removing barriers and the like. So those are really the things that we must include in the TIP. Other than that, it's sort of up to the council's discretion on what they want to include on the TIP. That can include things like safety projects, non-motorized projects, you name it, pretty much anything that the council wants to do. So with that stage being set, we are going to then now talk about one pathway to prioritize projects. So this was explained a little bit more detail in the agenda bill, but we did want to use work that has already been done, partly because we have some really significant time constraints, but also because we think that it's the most efficient path forward. So in saying that, the suggestion here is to reuse a prioritization effort that was employed for the TMP, the Transportation Master Plan. The TMP was never adopted. However, we think that this part of that effort has some merit to be reused, kind of dusted off and apply it to this program. A lot of the factors still remain the same in terms of criteria applied to transportation projects. So again, we think that there is some merit to relook at that. And then also just kind of setting the stage here that prioritization, the reason why we think it might be helpful in this process is because it results in a rank order of projects. And that's really important in transportation planning. You'll find that almost all the transportation planners talk about prioritization and ranking, because it really helps us understand where, when you cut the funding off, what are the projects that make that cut? And then from there, what gets implemented. So, you know, when you start looking at when you match the money with the project need, where do you make that cut and which projects get cut? So that's why it's important and something that we want to look at. So for tonight, really, we need direction from council on what the methodology to be used. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment here, but we plan to come back to council on the 10th of May. So that's in the 2 weeks with a resolution kind of formalizing that process. That way we can proceed forward on building the TIP. If we don't get direction today, we think that there's maybe a couple different pathways, but essentially some considerations for the council in answering the question on how we want to prioritize projects is the methodology I'm about to describe, is that sufficient? And if not, if you don't feel that it's sufficient, are there small tweaks that we can make to really address the needs of the council so that we can proceed forward and not kind of get off track on completing the TIP? Things that you can consider for that, and I'll get into this in a little bit, but we can look at removing some criteria, we can look at changing the weight of some criteria, or how scoring is done in terms of the raw scores. If we don't think that it can be tweaked to meet the council's needs, then I think that the outcome of that kind of flow chart is that a new system will need to be developed, but that is quite a significant effort. It's essentially a huge effort on its own. And so we would suggest that that's contemplated for the next year's TIP. And then, you know, maybe the pathway that council goes down for like a less formal prioritization would be assigning dollars to projects by year and effectively prioritizing it that way, using the funding allocations in the TIP, as opposed to a methodology on its own. So I'm going to dive into what we're thinking here, and this is pulled out of the agenda bill. So in the TMP, the Transportation Master Plan that was not adopted, we developed a system to prioritize projects so that we could, again, show where we were cutting the funding and which projects made that cut. We went out to the community in the early parts of the TMP to determine what was important to the community, what were the priorities, what were the things that people really cared about. And through that outreach, we got these, really it was 6 at first, and we added the 7th later on, but it was really these high important values of the community. It started off with making the system efficient. There was a lot of desire to have a really efficient system, and I'll get into what each of these means in a little bit more detail here in a second. And then making sure that the system was connected to the region. That really gets at commute trips. We know there's a lot of bottlenecks getting off the plateau, but really it was, those were kind of the top 2, is make the system efficient and make it connected so that I can get to my job a lot easier. And then after that was system connectedness. And what we mean here is kind of those internal connections, those non-motorized connections, and also bus transit connections too. So making the system more connected internally to Smamish. Also really high with the community was fiscal responsibility. That's something that came up a lot in terms of people wanting to be realistic about what we can afford and making sure that we got the most bang for the buck. And then, of course, as is almost always the case when talking about transportation, safety comes up really heavily. People want to feel safe when they walk on the street. They want to feel safe when they drive on the street. And making it just a welcoming environment for everyone. And that kind of gets at getting the system more connected too. And then what always comes up in Smamish is community character. We know that the residents here really have a strong connection to the environment and the way that the community feels. And we wanted to make sure that the roads and the right-of-way contributed to that character. So that's things like visual appeal. It's things like connecting to parks and a variety of things that really improve the experience of driving through the city. And then I mentioned that the 7th priority was added later, and that's sort of when we got really out into the community and talking about projects, we wanted to incorporate that community input. And so that this last one is to reflect the community input so that we understood that the community supported projects and that the investments matched what the community wanted. So those were the 7 criteria. And you'll see in parentheses next to each of those, there's a weight assigned to it. Based on the importance of the priority to the scoring system, we did weight it. The reason for the weighting is because if you've ever done a prioritization effort, you'll know that sometimes there's a clumping that happens in projects. So if you assign scoring, you'll notice, oh, it's really hard to see what's a top tier and what's a mid-tier project and where that break is. The weighting really helped us see very clearly what the breakout was. It was much clearer to see what projects were in the top tier and what projects were in the mid-tier and the low tier. So again, it was just a helpful way to really clearly show what was top priority. So now I'll go into each criteria on its own, a little bit more detail. I did kind of try to do a high level a moment ago, but so when we talk about efficiency, we're talking again about those new street connections, improving operations, and really this, the way that I think about this is it's about the principal arterials in a lot of ways, 228th, Issaquah-Pine Road, and Issaquah-Pulse Road. So this is, again, making the system more efficient so that we can maximize what we already have. And then number 2 is, again, linking to the region. This is really about commute trips. A project that really comes to mind on this one is the intersection of 202 and Sahalee. This is a project that would need a lot of coordination with regional partners, but is a key connection for residents getting out of the city. The third criteria being more connected system. This is again about that kind of multimodal, non-motorized connections, getting access to transit, and really internally providing more ways to get from your home to other destinations. Fiscally sustainable, again, just making sure that there's a lot of bang for the buck here. One thing that comes up is impact fees. As we talked earlier tonight, there are a lot of restrictions on impact fees. We want to be sure that we're using those most effectively, and again, getting the biggest bang for the buck there. The other thing that comes up here is the eligibility for outside funding. This is, that's kind of a way of saying grant funds. And what we mean there is projects that are appealing to funders tend to be those that are more regional in nature, the ones that, again, have the biggest bang for the buck, but really connects to the greater region and reduce some of that macro congestion that you see. And then, of course, investing in maintenance. That's always important for being fiscally responsible. I think Jeff has mentioned it a couple of times tonight, but we have a pavement overlay program that we really need to ensure that our roads are not going to such a state where they can no longer be paved over, they have to be reconstructed. So that's a big difference. That's essentially a small peanuts to a big big dollar amount in terms of overlay versus reconstruction. So trying to preserve what we already have. Safety, again, this would be addressing high collision areas, adding traffic calming, reducing speeds, and improving pedestrian mobility in the system. Community character, again, I've mentioned some of these, but really investing in ways that contribute to the Smamish character. That's, the visual side of things, and even just connecting to parks. I think that adds to the character of Smamish. Then the final criteria is reflecting community input. Again, just ensuring that the community supports the project and investments match up with the preferences. So I wanted to show an example, and I apologize, these slides did not make it into the version that went into the packet, so these are new, this slide and the next slide. But we did feel it was important to kind of walk the council through how this might be applied to an example project. So if you bear with me for a few minutes, I'll kind of walk through how we would apply that system that I just described. So for instance, just by way of example, we took Issaquah-Pine Road, the first phase of that, which would be Kahani Boulevard to Southeast 32nd. And basically that project, as it was originally conceived, is a 3-lane project. So it'd be an expansion of the Issaquah-Pine Road. There'd be a 2-way left turn lane in the middle or a median at parts of it. There'd be bike lanes, sidewalks, planter strips, and essentially a complete street. So this would be a redo of the whole stretch of that corridor. In this case, we're focusing on just the segment. But just to give you kind of a sense that that image on the bottom right is what it would look like. And the map is kind of just generally pointing out where the project is. So how this project was scored previously. So as you can see on the left in the table, I have all the criteria there. And then I have the scoring based on just the unweighted scores. And in your agenda bill, we describe how the scoring options are. So there's, if you meet the criteria and you exceed that criteria, you get 30 points. If you just meet it and kind of, you've done the kind of middle ground of it, you would get 20 points. And then if you do not meet that criteria, you get 0 points. And then, so you can see how those scores are applied in that second column there. The third column is the weighted score. So as you might recall from the earlier slide, there are weights applied to each of those criteria and then applied there and summed at the bottom. What I will say is the highest score for the weighted score is 420 points. So as you can see, this one scores pretty high at 335. And so I'll just walk through each of those criteria. So for system efficiency, it got the most points because it was an improvement to a principal arterial. That is probably the easiest way to make a system more efficient. Similarly, for regional connectivity, this scored the highest. It connects to the city of Issaquah. It's a popular commute route. It would really help us, get people off the plateau and connect to the region. For connectedness, this, because it is a complete street type of project, it improves non-motorized connections. And as you see here, it got the full points in the raw score, and then the weight of system connectedness is 1.5 as opposed to 2 for the first two. And then fiscally responsible, this is an impact fee eligible project, so it did score the highest. And in that case, it also appeals to funders because it is regional in nature, and it's something that we think we'd be pretty confident in getting grant funding for. And then for the safety, there's a lot of pedestrian improvements here. Again, on that previous slide, showing the bike lanes, the sidewalks, curb gutter, all of that. It's the whole full meal deal. And so it is a much safer route for a road that is currently can be somewhat unsafe in portions of it. And then for the community character, this got a 20 out of instead of 30. And that's because it really contributes to the character through the landscaping enhancements and sort of the beautification. It does not necessarily connect to parks or have any great stormwater features or anything like that. It kind of does a moderate enhancement there. So it scored a 20 on that one. And then for community input, this one was a really popular project in the TNP effort. It scored the highest, 30 out of 30 there. It did receive a lot of support from the community, so it was a very popular project. So again, that's how, just kind of flying high level here, but that's how we would apply to an example project, this criteria system, just to kind of give you an idea. So I'll stop talking after this slide and open it up for council questions, but just to reiterate, this is a repeated slide, but we do need direction from council on how we want to prioritize projects. Is the methodology that I just described, is that sufficient? Can it be tweaked? Can we look at maybe tweaking some of the weighting? Can we maybe remove criteria, something like that, to make it fit the council's needs at the moment? And then again, if not, I think that means that a new system will need to be contemplated for the next year's. Thank you. Questions?
We got several of them for you here. Deputy Mayor Clark.
Yeah, thank you. So I do have a couple thoughts. So for that system connectedness, that 1.5 weighted, personally, I would like to see that higher. The same with fiscal responsibility. And then just looking at, sorry, yeah, you can go back. Looking at the details of what each means. I mean, for like criteria 1, I think, since there's some cross of pedestrians, trails, connectivity, bike paths, like for criteria 1, I think I would see that more as like safety efficiency, and then criteria 2 and 3 as like one. Linking to regional opportunities and connectedness seem sort of similar to me. I get it, it's more of like internal and other modes of transportation, but I just am like, how could we simplify this? So combining those two. And then as far as like I said, from criteria 5, taking out that safety and making it kind of up with criteria 1, so safety and efficiency. And then I'm kind of struggling with the community character and welcoming part of it, because I kind of feel like if we are fiscally sustainable, if we are connected, if we are efficient, and we are safe, I feel like that's kind of welcoming and community character. So I would support, eliminating some of those things to try and, kind of pare it down to like 3 or 4 criteria. So thank you.
Thank you. That's really good input. I think that's definitely something we can work with.
Councilmember Lamb.
Thanks, Doug. The one thing that I'm not seeing in the scoring system is how the environment is taken into account here. Like, what is the environmental impact? How do you weight that? Do you take away points, if you will, or do you add weight? So, I mean, we're talking about adding roads, which have a lot of impervious surfaces, and that's going to have, tremendous amount of environmental impact. So it may be, adding to the system efficiency, but then there has to be, the environment weighted against that as well. So how do we take that into account?
Yeah, that's a good question. Would you be looking at specific parts of environmental impacts, like say greenhouse gas emissions or maybe wetland impacts, that kind of thing? Or is it just kind of a global look at just impacts in general? Are there specifics out of that?
I guess I'd be looking to you for that, or your team, and how, I guess we could take a look at how other cities measure environmental impact when it comes to roads and other transportation systems. So I'm not sure, but greenhouse gas emissions could be one of them. The amount of impervious surfaces we lay down. So that'd be something I'd probably look to you guys for.
Okay, yeah, we can. I'll talk to Jeff and Audrey and the team and get some thoughts on that. That might be kind of an in-depth effort, so I'm not sure if that's something that we could turn around quick enough on the tip. But we can do our best to kind of figure out how to incorporate something like that.
I definitely think it's something we need to look at and really seriously look at, because the environment should be right up there when it comes to these this huge infrastructure that we're looking at building.
Definitely, yeah, absolutely.
Councilmember Treen.
Okay, Doug, so based on the comments of my fellow council members, which I don't disagree with them, the environment was missing. Because I don't think that providing a safe and welcoming environment is what, when I think of environment, I'm talking about how many trees are going to be removed, how much impervious surface, how am I going to handle the runoff. So that's the issue that I believe Councilmember Lamb was talking about, and I agree with her. The issue of safety, I think actually could almost, if it's not tied with efficiency, it should be actually by itself. That, because when I think about safety, I'm thinking about emergency, the big picture of emergency safety in the case of a natural disaster. But then I'm also looking at, are our roads safe for the drivers? And then what about the pedestrians? And then after that, you have the multimodal And one of the things I noticed on Saturday when I was doing the Earth Day presentation on the right-of-way, electric skateboarder, the uni-wheel guys came by, electric bikes came by. So we have multimodal transportation is going by my roadway because the trail right now is currently under construction. And so I'm looking at that, well, it needs to be safer for those people too, because it's not that safe on East Lake Smamish Parkway for multimodal transportation. So safety in itself could be almost its own prioritization and or a criteria. So, and I have two others that I'm looking at too about intersection safety, then corridor safety. So it gets really kind of complex, right? So here's, Doug, here's my question. Based on saying all that kind of stuff and how complex this is, and this is a TCIP that we are supposed to approve by June, I believe, as a council, would it be in our best interest as this council to kind of make this a priority for 2024, 2023, or 2024, and that we take a second look at TCIP that is kind of a stripped down version that was presented to the previous council, and look at that as passing a TCIP that we know we can do in the next 6 years with the revenue sources that we know we have, and that we can meet those probabilities. Is that something that would be a better direction for this? Do you think that would be a better direction, or is that a direction we might want to take or consider?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can work with whatever the council wants to do. Absolutely. If you know, in thinking about the conversation a few minutes ago about revenues, and we're looking at a more conservative take on revenues, then prioritization is harder to apply because you would have, you know, Jeff showed in the beginning a list of projects that we've already in some ways committed to. So you have, you know, our ADA program, our intersection failures. We have the Southeast 218th corridor that we're pursuing grant funding on, Esquapin Lake Road. So those projects on their own probably exceed that 33 plus or minus 30, you know, $33 to $38 million range if you're assuming high and good funding. Mm-hmm. So prioritization is, you know, you cut it off higher, and so you're looking at just the most critical projects at that point. So, so I do think that's something for council to consider. You know, in the presentation on April 12th, we did talk about the approach this year is going to be do the TIP in a narrow fashion so that we can reflect the currently adopted level of service standards. And then when the EIS code and comp plan amendments happen later in this year, when the alternative 4 from the EIS, those projects get incorporated, then you have the bigger conversation about the much larger system needs. So I do think that there's something to consider there that that council can consider for sure. But you know, in any case, the staff will pursue whatever the council directs us to tonight.
Okay, so can you go back to that slide then that showed the options or whatever there? Because it said something about like get a new system in. Here, let me go back. I'll find it. I'm sorry.
Doug, it's the outcome slide. What are we asking?
Yes, outcomes. Thank you, Jeff, for
yeah. This slide.
Yes, there you go. Perfect.
This one? Okay, good.
Right. So I'm just so what? It's like I like the methodology. I like where we're headed. I just also look at the complexity of this methodology and how to do a rating scale and how much time it would take even the council to come to an agreement on what that would be, even if we were just tweaking it. Maybe we can get there. But I'm just looking at that, okay, how about let's contemplate the new system for the 2024, 2029 TCIP, which would happen in 2023. And then this year, let's pass a tip that we can do knowing that it's going to change in 2023. Okay, back to you, Mayor. I mean, unless someone wants to add something there, I think that's a good direction for this council to go based on revenue streams, based on, that we still have work to do on the EIS. Thank you very much.
Councilmember Howe.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, what I appreciate so much about this presentation is you showed us lots of options, and you've exposed us to lots of options, which is a nice holistic view of what's possible out there. And I think that informs our thinking and makes us, frankly, better at making good decisions. I'm kind of more inclined to stay with, frankly, more granularity with your matrix in terms of being able to assign different weighting systems to different aspects. So I'm rather fond of what you've done here. Don't have a problem with the fact that there's several. Would like to see the weight increased on fiscal responsibility, however. And to speak to Councilmember Lamb's point about environment, trying to find a way to look through an environmental lens at everything that we do is tricky. But I'm suspicious that there's weren't you talking about, or wasn't Doug talking about transit to some extent in terms of transportation efficiencies? Does transit fit there? Yes, or am I wrong?
Yeah, transit's more about the system connectedness, I believe, but absolutely it does play into efficiencies as well.
Okay.
And
it ties back to the environmental part too.
Yeah, yeah.
So if there's a way to kind of pull that out or call that out, I think that works. So I like the methodology that you've deployed. I think it's smart and useful.
Thank you.
Councilmember Moran.
Two things. One, the environmental impact. I agree that is being left out of this equation. I don't know what points you would put to it or how you would work that in. But the one thing that is missing here, and I think it's number one, it's the reason I voted against the TMP to start with, and so I'm disappointed it's not on here as, number one starred, and that is safety. Our safety routes in this city, we do not have planned ways out of this city. When we had an earthquake, we lost East Lake Smamish, and so we lost an exit route. When we had the flooding a couple of years ago, we lost 244th, so we lost an exit route. So if we do not call out our exit routes and we do not put a scoring to those exit routes, I think that is a terrible mistake. And I think that if we don't put extra weight to those, I think we're doing the residents a huge disservice because we do have things that we have to be prepared for. We're going to have to be prepared for things such as wildfires. We've got the gas line that runs through the city, earthquakes, any of the other things that happen up here. That we need to have those routes. We need to have those roads ready and not ones that fall apart at a drop of a hat. So those routes, to me, safety is number one. And if we want to have safety, to me, safety is the exits for the city, anybody who lives in the city, then we started for pedestrians, bikes, cars, multimodal, I mean, right up the line. But safety is number one. And safety is the reason I voted against the TMP to start with. It just wasn't even listed. And they didn't even have a section on safety in the TMP. So I guess to me, the scoring system without having something of safety in it, it can't be scored without it in there.
Is that something that, in terms of evacuation routes, adding to regional connectivity, is that something that we can incorporate to that criteria? because I do think that there's some overlap there in terms of, you know, if an evacuation is necessary, getting people off the plateau, you'd be using a route that would be connected to the region. And I think that that's really what criteria number 2 is hitting at.
Yeah, we don't have many, so I would suspect it would probably fall under regional. I mean, we just don't have that many exit routes.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
So I think you were tasked with a nearly impossible feat for creating a scoring system that the council could agree on. So kudos for doing what you did here. I think largely it's very good. I have a few things, and first of all, nowhere on here is concurrency failures, and those have to be the priority as a primary, because if we have something that's failing, it has to go to the top of the list. So I'm not sure how we're going to incorporate existing concurrency failures into a scoring criteria when we know we have to do those in that 6-year window. Secondarily, I think you guys were very strategic in these buckets, and you can't just look at the slide that's present on our screen here. You also have to look a little bit deeper at the definitions and bullet points that you put there, because I think stormwater is incorporated in here. It's incorporated under community character. And it talks about stormwater on that slide specifically. So there it is, stormwater, character, et cetera. So I think we've got that. And we have stormwater regulations. Those are going to drive what we do with impervious surfaces. So I think we've checked that box already based on other adopted regulations that we have. And as far as environment, I'm not really sure how you entwine that into criteria when you're talking about inevitably laying down or making changes to our transportation network. Bike paths, paths in general, these are all likely impervious surfaces. And again, all of those impervious surfaces have regulations that we ourselves have to subscribe to. We also have the public works standards that are going to drive all of these, and we can't make concessions to ourselves on the public works standards and then not assume that we would offer those same concessions to developers that walk in the door and say, well, you didn't have to do this. I think there is director discretion built into code, and that was somewhat strategic. I can recall an instance where there was a wetland and a developer was going to have to put a sidewalk, and there were trees, and we were able to make some concessions in order for preservation. So I think there are environmental things built in, even if they're not expressly stated. But when we have a concurrency failure, whether we're talking about an intersection or, you know, potentially out in the future something to volume to capacity, then our public works standards ultimately drive what we have to do. So I think if, you know, as council, if we take issue with that, then it's actually at the public works standards that we need to direct our concerns relative to impervious surfaces, not at the TCIP. This is driven by regulation, and our policy work previous to this will guide what we do here. So I will echo the fact that I think fiscal responsibility probably needs slightly greater weight than 1.5 times. And it's hard to try and move things around and make it all work right so that not everything ends up being weighted 2 times. But I think, you know, community character does, and safety, we speak to providing a safe, I'm not sure what welcoming means. I've got to be honest with you. I read the bulleted points and I'm like, it sounds good, but it's really driving on safety. And I think that's the most important thing. I think community character kind of speaks a little bit to the welcoming aspect that I think you are after, which is, hey, we don't want to just lay down asphalt. We want it to actually look nice too. And I think we did that very well when we put down Southeast 4th, right? We have medians, they're treed, they've tons of daffodils blooming in there right now. So I think the welcoming part is probably embedded in the community character part as well, but that way, safety is kind of a standalone item. And under that bulleted point, I think it talks about intersections, high collision areas of the city. And of course, we want to heavily weight those. But again, I think the concurrency thing, I'm not sure how that's plugging into these criterias, because if we put all this in and it spits out a bunch of projects and at the end of the day, we're like, that doesn't look at all what like I thought was going to come out as far as here's our hierarchy of projects. There has to be that top tier of those concurrency failures, because we have to address those regardless of what box they're checking on this criteria. So that's my feedback.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Those are all really good points, and there's actually a lot in there. And as you're talking, I had a few things come to mind. And I'll start with the concurrency thing. I realized I didn't mention when we did the TMP. You're absolutely, you hit a perfect point. We scored all the projects, but the ones that were addressing concurrency failures, we actually put them in a different category. That was these are number one regardless. They were in their own category. And we would do something similar for this. The 3 intersections that are failing right now, those, regardless of what they score, they are on the tip. They have to be on the tip, no matter what. So we would still score them, but put them in their own category.
Great.
So I did gloss over it. I did just forgot about it. So sorry about that. Thanks for reminding me. Your other point about environment, I did, after Councilmember Lamb brought it up, I was thinking, listening and thinking at the same time. So maybe these thoughts are a little jumbled. But environment is going to be a little bit hard. And of course, we'll talk about this. Jeff, Audrey, and I will talk more about how to incorporate this. But some initial thoughts that I had were, sometimes you're dealing with competing objectives. That tends to be what public service is always about, is competing objectives. So if you're looking, just by way of example, if you're widening a road, say you're taking Esquapanic Road and you're widening it for that 3-lane section that we showed earlier, you're adding impervious surface, but at the same time, you're very likely to reduce vehicle miles traveled. So you might have impacts on the ground, more immediate, but the long-term potential reduction in greenhouse gas emissions due to lowered VMT, so there's a balance that we need to strike there, right? So it's kind of like when you talk about other criteria that are a little complex, sometimes it's hard to tell what's good and what's bad. So, what would bring that score down if you're looking at the whole picture? It can be kind of complicated. So those are some considerations we'd have to provide to it. I think there's a way that we could, find a way to make it work. We'll probably have to, again, Jeff and Audrey and I put our heads together and think of some ways. Not to say it's impossible, but I do think that the takeaway there is competing objectives. And then Mayor, you had a third point, and as I was talking, I forgot it. I was going to answer one of those questions, and I'm very sorry.
I don't know. I packed a lot in there. I think I talked about fiscal responsibility, and that some of these things are embedded in the criteria themselves, just not so explicitly stated, maybe, like stormwater is embedded in the community character. But Doug, you couldn't have put it more eloquently by saying competing objectives, because that's really what we're doing here. I think when you were talking about Esquapine Lake Road in particular, when we're talking about adding asphalt down, I think, but there's the competing objective of, well, do you not add the asphalt and then have, basically potential unsafe situations on the road, or do you add the asphalt and then have safer situations? So I think, that is exactly what we're dealing with up here, and it is the nature of the seats that we're sitting in, is that we can't always get everything, but we've got to make the best choices given those before us. So thanks for putting that so eloquently. Councilmember Moran.
Well, first, Doug, I'm glad to see you forget things at your age. I forget things going from the office to the living room and that sort of thing. One, if looking at criteria 5, and I want to repeat something that was said, which was the word welcoming. Yeah, I don't know what that means actually either. But focusing on the word safety, and then reading the bullets that are underneath it, I think that could send us in a very good start for kind of where I was headed. And just trying to open up the safety routes of kind of where I was going. And I think if we look at the safety plan that the city has and look at the safety routes that are identified for the different, I know he's got the different plans, and I know he's got the different routes that are listed. So I think if you look at those, it should identify the primary routes, and you should be able to see which roads. And from that, it should tell us, it should be able to give us kind of a better idea of, you know, which primary roads we would be using.
Okay, yeah,
Jeff?
thank you.
Thank you.
We have a very short window to turn something back around. I think we're going to attempt to do it and then ask on May 10th, did we hit the mark? And if we did, then we've got something to work with. If we don't, we're Councilmember Treen's idea of maybe we need to do some, you know, some longer reaching on this. I think that we can consolidate and expand. So competing interests, right? We can consolidate some of these things and then qualify them with some other bullets that go underneath them. And I think that might address some of the issues. The one thing I didn't hear from Councilmember Howe was well, how's the public going to be involved? And I kind of went, well, I was expecting that. I was waiting. I wrote a note down here and I was going to put her initials on it, public involvement. How are we going to do that? And so when we think about this a little bit more, when we come back to you on the 10th, is it worthy of waiting? Because again, we are going to have a limited tip with the buckets of money that we're proposing. And, you know, these using a priority scheme helps us move projects from the long range list, you know, to the 6-year tip, you know, kind of down the road. So we ought to contemplate that when we get there. But I think we can take a stab at what we heard and synthesize what we've done and then decide, is it the right time? Because it might not be, given, you know, a whole variety of things. And I think we're okay with that if you guys are as well. So Doug, is that kind of okay, or?
Yeah, I think it'll be tight, but I think we'll need to talk a little further, Jeff.
Okay.
And
like I said, we're going to put something together based on what we heard. It might not be what collectively you want, but we're going to ask for a go, no go, and then decide if it's a wait, and then come back kind of thing. So we'll endeavor to synthesize what we heard. We may or may not get it right. We'll have a shot on May 10th to see if that's okay. And assuming that we do, then we will process whatever projects against that and develop the tip. Because now we'll have the money piece in terms of limitations of, expectations and boundaries of revenue, because we talked about that tonight, both short-term and long-term. We'll have prioritization in there, and we'll be able to take that really big spreadsheet and see what it tells us, so that we can, you know, bring this redo. I mean, this is the first time it's been redone in 3 years. So we're all kind of learning this as we go forward. So recreating it. Next time around, it should be easier. We should be able to advance a project, right? You know, from, you know, depending upon things, or some new monies happen, whatever. But anyway, I think it's exciting. We're poised for the challenge, and I guess give us a little bandwidth and a little grace on the 10th, and we'll see if we got there.
So Jeff, really quick, because you said you were going to attempt to synthesize a lot of different voices up here, speaking of competing interests, but that you're also bringing back that financial piece as well. Are you doing that on May 10th, or will we expect that May 24th? I'm looking
May 24th is the
workshop.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so for the May 24th.
Yes, May 10th, we're going to ask for a go, no go on the prioritization. And on the 24th, we're going to do a deep dive on the projects with or without the prioritization scheme.
Okay. Just trying to
Because
understand
each project, each
just
project
trying to
has its
understand
own
what we're
dimension.
going to expect on which date.
Yep, no, good call. Good
Okay.
call.
Councilmember Treen?
Mayor Malchow, you asked my question, so I'm good. And then obviously to just emphasize that the concurrency projects will also be, or Jeff, are you going to bring concurrency projects to us to the 3, or are we going to not see that?
Our prioritization scheme will include concurrency projects are first. You know, I mean, they happen because we don't want to forget them. And then there's this other stuff that happens, right? So
thank you.
Mayor, can I add real quick?
Of course.
Yeah, just to build off of what Jeff said about the upcoming dates. So on May 10th, as he said, we're looking for just a go, no go on the project prioritization. We will likely be coming with a resolution on that just to get something formalized in one spot that everyone can see. So just be prepared for that.
Sounds good.
Okay, so we have a couple slides to finish up. If there's any more questions, we can address them after the next couple slides. So we kind of talked a little bit about this, but so May 10th, we're coming back on a go, no go for the project prioritization and resolution listed up there on the slide. May 24th is our next workshop, very similar to this format, except we will be focusing more on the projects. You know, again, the other half of the tip, focusing on really the draft of that transportation capital improvement plan. Jeff has kind of shown a little preview of it in the beginning of this meeting, but we'll be able to kind of step through all of that detail on the 24th. Then we will go again to council on the 7th of June. That will be a little bit of a tight turnaround, but we will at that point have hopefully a refined draft of that tip and open the hearing. That is a requirement of this process, and we want to hear from the public. Are we hitting the mark? What are some commentary that the public has? And then we would look to adopt the tip on July 5th. So those are the upcoming dates, and we're going to try as hard as we can to stick to that, but we can adjust as needed. And then just some other kind of housekeeping things. We will, after tonight, we're going to be reviewing all the input we've had. There's been a lot of really good commentary, a lot of good discussion. So thank you for that. We'll adjust as we need to, and then come back on the 10th. We still need to work internally with our teams on just making sure that internally our draft tip is hitting the right mark. So that includes our CIP folks as well as our traffic folks. So definitely an open conversation there. We also need to continue working with our finance department, Chris and Aaron, on refining the financial data. I think we had a couple caveats tonight that the money side of the equation is still subject to change. We're still refining it. You know, we took a lot of good input today about getting better and more accurate assumptions in things like the TIF and REIT. So we have some work to do there, but definitely something we're going to do before we come back to council. So thank you. Really good discussion. We very much appreciate the time. I know this was a special meeting, so thank you so much. And that's it for me. If there's any other questions?
No, I just wanted to make one comment, though, just to somewhat address council members how concerned about the public being brought along here, which is that hearing that we'll have. And I think, you know, they're hopefully, if they're going to give us feedback, hopefully they're listening as we go along through this process. But the hearing that's currently slated for June 7th, we can also keep open. So it's not that we have to close the hearing on the 7th. If we're adopting on July 5th, we'll have several opportunities to extend that hearing, and that will allow us as council more time to garner public feedback should they have it. So I just wanted to highlight that.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Council, anything else before we sign off? No? Well, thank you. I think we all appreciate and understand that this is a lot of work to try and rework the TIP and then a new process in order to fulfill it, never mind the whole financial piece. So thank you for all of your hard work and continued work on this project. We appreciate it.
Team effort. Thank you.
All right. Council, I think we're adjourned here.
Thank you. Really great work.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Appreciate it.